And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on NowTV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I really want to ask you to please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. Uh, our channel is growing, not as fast as I would like for it to, but we're definitely growing. We're approaching 8,000 subscribers. And as I've mentioned before, my goal is 10,000 subscribers before I pass from the scene. I don't know how long that will be. Okay. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just simply saying that's kind of my goal. And we have experienced really good growth over the last couple of years. I appreciate that so very much. Get rid of this phone here. All right. So, we have been discussing at length what I call the challenge of Christ. The challenge of Christ is found in John chapter 10, 37, 38. It is a very simple challenge, but it is a profoundly important challenge. Jesus said, "If I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me." Even if you do not believe me, Jesus said, believe the works which I do. Now listen, folks, I've shared with you many times here on Now TV. Atheists, skeptics, Jews, Muslims, they all tell us, okay, Jesus said, if I do not do the works of my Father, then don't believe me. He said he was going to come back in the first century in judgment. He very clearly did not do that. How do you answer that challenge, believer? Are you capable of answering that challenge? I can tell you right now, I have encountered any number of folks who call themselves Christians, and when they're confronted with that challenge, when they're confronted with Jesus, pardon me, Jesus' own words about what he was supposed to do in that first century, pardon me, they're literally dumbstruck. They don't know how to answer that challenge. It is critical, ladies and gentlemen, that you and I, if we claim to be followers of Christ, we must, according to 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart and be ready always to give an answer. That word answer there is from the Greek word apologia, and it has been changed into meaning, well, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean that, or I didn't mean to do that, or I didn't mean to say that. That's not the meaning of apologia in the first century. Apologia, when Peter wrote, means to give an orderly, logical defense of what you believe. It means, basically, and it's a legal term, it means to be able to stand up in court and say, I am a Christian, here is why I am a Christian. Well, in the context of the challenge of Christ, you and I, therefore, are called on by Peter, by Jesus, by the New Testament writers. We're called upon to be able to defend our faith in Jesus as the Son of God. And if Jesus did not do what he said he was going to do, he cannot be defended. But you see, the marvelous news is he kept his word. I understand that flies in the face of church history. I understand it flies in the face of the creeds. But folks, we dare not take our stand on creeds which simply misunderstood the story of eschatology. And so I've been sharing with you now for a good long while that the problem with the traditional views of eschatology is that it teaches, the tradition does, it teaches a wrong concept of the very nature of the coming of Christ. Traditional eschatology says, well, yeah, Jesus said he was going to come back on a literal cumulus cloud. He's going to come back as a 5'5" Jewish man, and he's going to destroy literal physical heaven and earth, put an end to time, and he's either going to recreate a physical earth after he purges it with fire, or he's going to destroy the cosmos and take all believers to heaven. Folks, that is the wrong concept of the nature of eschatology. Completely false. I've shared with you that Jesus said he was going to come back not as a 5'5" Jewish man, but he was going to act as the Father had acted. The Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father. Matthew 16:27, which means very simply, he was going to act in the same way the Father had acted. Well, here's what's shocking to most believers. Most believers have the idea that the day of the Lord is invariably a reference to that end of time event. I was raised that way. I was raised believing that that's the definition of the day of the Lord. Just this week, actually last week, an individual posted in response to me on Facebook, well, you just simply don't understand. The day of the Lord is an earth-burning event, time-ending event, and this individual was trying to negate the time statements, and he said, look, Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 15, the day of the Lord is near. It is very near. And it's now been, 2,600 years almost since Zephaniah wrote that. The day of the Lord hasn't come yet. Therefore, time statements don't mean anything. Well, you see, the problem there, ladies and gentlemen, is they have the wrong definition of the day of the Lord. And I've shared with you over and over and over again. Biblically, the day of the Lord is any time in which God in his sovereignty used one nation to judge another nation. A really cool passage, by the way. In Ezekiel chapter 13, 5 and 6, the Lord castigated not only the false prophets of Judah, but the children of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And he said, you are those, you just run off doing everything in the world instead of spending the time building up the wall of Jerusalem to prepare for the day of the Lord. Wait a minute. Hang on here. If the day of the Lord is an earth-burning, time-ending event in which the entire cosmos is burned up in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, could somebody explain to me how fortifying the walls of Jerusalem or any other city would be proper preparation for the day of the Lord? I mean, boom, it's gone. Right? The day of the Lord was going to be the destruction of Jerusalem in that particular case. We have the day of the Lord against Egypt in Isaiah 19 and 20. We have the day of the Lord against Jerusalem again, Jeremiah chapter 4. We have the day of the Lord when the Lord would come out of heaven, tread on the tops of the mountains, and the mountains would melt under his feet in the destruction of the 10 northern tribes, Micah chapter 1, verse 2 and following. We have the day of the Lord against numerous cities, Tyre, Sidon, again, Egypt, at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. On and on it goes. The fact is, the day of the Lord was never, ever defined in Scripture as a time, and this is segue into where we're going this morning. The day of the Lord was never to be a time-ending, earth burning event. And somebody says, well, wait a minute, Preston. Didn't Peter say that they were eagerly awaiting a new heaven and new earth wherein dwells righteousness after the day of the Lord, in which the earth and the elements that are therein shall be burned up? Isn't that what Peter said? Well, yes, that's exactly what he said. However, to take this language literally, instead of metaphorically, figuratively, is a gross misunderstanding of the nature of Hebraic apocalyptic language. Folks, this is the basic fallacy and the basic problem of dispensationalism. It's one of the problems of amillennialism. So, what I've been doing is I've been sharing with you how biblical eschatology is about the changing of covenant. It is not historical eschatology, i.e., it's not about the end of history. It is about the end of the old covenant, i.e., covenant eschatology. This is brought out very powerfully, in my estimation, in the book of Daniel. Now, keep in mind what I've shared with you. I'll only go over this very, very quickly. In the book of Daniel, Daniel is writing. He realizes, all right, Judah had been taken off into Babylonian captivity. Why? Because of her unrighteousness, because of her rebellion. Daniel knew that Jeremiah the prophet, Jeremiah chapter 29, had predicted that they would be in captivity for 70 years. And at the end of 70 years, they'd be allowed to go back to Jerusalem. Guess what? The time was almost up. So he prays to the Lord. When do we return? The time is up. And the archangel was sent to him and told two things, basically. Yes, you will return to Jerusalem, but that's not the ultimate promise. 70 weeks, 70 weeks are determined, among other things. There's 6 constituent elements in Daniel 9:24. 70 weeks are determined to bring in everlasting righteousness. Now watch, Judah had been taken into Babylonian captivity. Why? Because of unrighteousness. Because the old law could not give or provide true righteousness. So God was making a promise that by the end of the 70th week of Daniel 9:24, a new covenant world. Because you see, Daniel's living under the old covenant world that could never provide righteousness. It was a world of unrighteousness, to express it like that. But here is Daniel being promised that the time was coming in which there would be a new world of everlasting righteousness. Again, folks, this is 2 covenant worlds. And so most people say, well, yeah, okay, Jesus is our righteousness, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and that is true. But is that the world of everlasting righteousness promised in Daniel 9? Last week I shared with you that in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 5, Paul, writing in approximately 49 to 50 AD, said, according to his promise, and through the Spirit, we eagerly await the hope of righteousness. Now, wait a minute. Jesus had already appeared. He had died on the cross. He had offered himself as a sacrifice for sin, to take away sin. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 26. So, Paul, how could you say they were still waiting on the hope of righteousness? Then we come to 2 Peter chapter 3. Now, we're going to have to spend some time on 2 Peter 3. I did this earlier, a couple of years ago. So, as is generally the case, since I did that a couple of years ago, I'm pretty sure, number one, we have a much larger audience now than we did then, so they haven't gone back and they haven't watched all of the videos. I got to tell you this very quickly. Just recently, an individual told me they had actually gone back and watched all 3,000 plus of my videos. I was like, I wouldn't watch all of my videos. I sort of kind of think I know what I said, but nonetheless, wow. Okay? So all I can do is say thank you so very much. So we need to spend time with 2 Peter chapter 3 because it promised the coming of a new heaven and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. Folks, let me reiterate. The very concept of righteousness is a covenantal concept. Do you catch the power of that? Righteousness has nothing to do with, let me say it like this, righteousness has nothing to do with bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes. It has nothing to do with bigger, prettier, greener, taller trees. It has nothing to do with pure water or with bigger, better, prettier clouds. In other words, it has nothing to do with a physically recreated physical creation. A world of righteousness has everything in the world to do with a restored relationship between heaven and earth. That is what a world of righteousness is all about. So let me ever so briefly remind you that in Genesis chapter 1, man was on earth, time was marching on, Adam and Eve sinned. God had told them, in the day you eat, that is, of the forbidden fruit, you will surely die. Now, folks, he didn't say, in the day you eat, you'll become mortal. He didn't say, in the day you eat, you'll receive a death penalty, and then sometime later, by and by, hundreds of years later, you'll eventually die. No. In the day you eat, you will surely die. When would they die? The day they ate. And yet people twist that. They change it. They distort it into say, you will not surely die in the day you eat. You will just be condemned to die on that day, but you will die hundreds of years later. Folks, that is a perversion of the language. But they didn't die physically that day, did they? What happened? They sinned. Thus they became unrighteous. And as a result of being unrighteous, they were kicked out of the garden. And the fellowship between heaven and earth was broken, fractured. As some ancient rabbis said, on the day that they sinned, an iron wall was erected between heaven and earth. And man, from that point forward, could not enter into heaven because of sin. And remember, the old law, the law of Moses, could never take away sin. It could never provide righteousness. Therefore, Paul said in Ephesians chapter 1, 9 and following, that it was God's eternal purpose before the very foundation of time that in the stewardship, Greek word oikonomia, administration, that in the stewardship of the last days, he would gather together in one body all things that are in heaven and that are on earth. So what was God's eternal intent? God's eternal intent was to restore the righteousness lost in the garden. And in restoring that righteous relationship, he would reunite heaven and earth. Now, let me ask you a question, ladies and gentlemen. When Adam and Eve were in the garden, they were on earth, right? They were in physical bodies, right? Time was marching on, right? After they sinned, they were still on earth. Time was marching on. The only thing different was the lack of fellowship, was their state of unrighteousness. That is what had to be restored. And so, in the prophetic books, and boy, I'm running out of time here, in the prophetic books, what do we find? We have the promise of the time in which God says, I'm going to put righteousness in Zion and place my salvation in Jerusalem. Isaiah 46:13. What's the focus? Righteousness. Building a bigger, better, prettier, stronger physical city of a literal physical Jerusalem has nothing whatsoever to do with righteousness. Righteousness is all about relationship. And this is why in covenant eschatology, as I've shared with you, death is seen as separation from God, alienation from God. Resurrection is seen as reconciliation with God, the restoration of righteousness, not the restoration of dirt, not the restoration of, to use the terminology again, bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes. It is the restoration of fellowship between heaven and earth. And Peter foretold the imminent arrival of that new heaven and that new earth wherein dwells righteousness. So, in the ensuing weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to do a deep dive into 2 Peter chapter 3 as it relates to Daniel chapter 9. Now, watch this, folks. You've got to catch the power of this. Daniel 9, 24 through 27, said that the bringing in of everlasting righteousness is confined to the 70 weeks of Daniel. Okay? The 70 weeks of Daniel cannot be extrapolated or extended beyond the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Therefore, the bringing in of the everlasting world of righteousness foretold by Daniel chapter 9, that world would arrive and be established no later than the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, how do I know this? Well, first of all, Daniel was told 70 weeks are determined upon your people and upon your holy city to bring in everlasting righteousness. You cannot, folks, you cannot get the establishment of the everlasting righteousness beyond the 70 weeks. 70 weeks are determined. They are cut out. They are appointed to bring in everlasting righteousness. Now, mind you, once it's established, it's everlasting. But it has to come, and it has to be had to be established. It is absolutely false, and it's wrong. It's a misinterpretation of Daniel chapter 9 to say, oh, well, things would happen within the 70 weeks, but after the 70 weeks would be the actual fulfillment. No, that is false. 70 weeks are determined to bring in to establish everlasting righteousness. Not after it, not before it. 70 weeks are determined to bring in everlasting righteousness. And then we have this from Daniel 9. Not only is the 70 weeks specifically determined to bring in everlasting righteousness, notice that we have a countdown. From the going forth of the decree to rebuild in Jerusalem, there shall be X amount of weeks, right? Then, after the 62nd and the 9th week, Messiah shall be cut off. He'll be cut off in the midst of the week. Well, folks, what comes after 69? If you're counting to 70, which is what Daniel is doing, if you're counting to 70 and Messiah would be cut off after the 69th week and in the midst of a week, that means he would be cut off in the midst of the 70th week. That's just the way math works. And then we are told, and this is in the Septuagint. Boy, I hope you catch the power of this. In the Septuagint, Daniel chapter 9, verse 27 says, at the end of the appointed time, at the Suntulia Kairu. Suntulia means closing, end, termination. So at the end of the appointed time. What is the appointed time, ladies and gentlemen? It's the 70th week. At the end of the appointed time, the end of desolations. What is the desolation? It's the abomination of desolation. It's the war. So at the end of the appointed time, an end shall be brought to the desolations. In other words, the war will be over. The appointed time is the 70 weeks. The end of the 70 weeks is the end of the war. Not in 34-35 AD. I'm completely out of time. I will see you next week.